The mountain man hadn't planned on attending church that Sunday morning in Fort Laramie, Wyoming Territory, but something had drawn him down from his cabin in the hills, and now he understood why. She sat 3 pews ahead, her blonde hair catching the morning light streaming through the simple wooden windows, and even from behind he could see her shoulders shaking with what looked like laughter. When she turned her face slightly to dab at her eyes with a handkerchief, he saw the truth written plainly across her delicate features. She was crying while wearing a smile so bright it could have lit the entire prairie. Adam Norwood had spent the better part of his 30 years learning to read signs in the wilderness. Animal tracks, weather patterns, the subtle shift in wind that meant danger or safety. But reading people had never been his strength, especially not women. Still, something about the contradiction of her expression pulled at something deep in his chest. He'd come to town for supplies and maybe a hot meal, nothing more. The church bells had been ringing as he'd tied his horse outside the general store, and some impulse he couldn't name had made him follow their call. The preacher was talking about joy in suffering, about finding God's grace in the hardest moments. Adam barely heard the words. His dark eyes remained fixed on the woman with tears streaming down her smiling face. She wore a simple blue calico dress, nothing fancy, but she held herself with a quiet dignity that spoke of strength. Around her, other townspeople sang hymns and nodded along with the sermon, but she seemed isolated in her own private world of contradictory emotion. When the service finally ended, Adam stood quickly, his tall frame and broad shoulders drawing glances from several of the congregation. At 6 feet 4 inches with muscles built from years of hunting, trapping, and surviving in the mountains, he was hard to miss. His dark hair fell past his collar, longer than was fashionable in town but practical for the life he led. His weathered leather vest and wool shirt marked him clearly as someone who lived outside civilization's careful boundaries. He waited near the door as people filed out, exchanging pleasantries with neighbors. The woman took her time, speaking briefly with an older couple, and he noticed how she kept that smile fixed in place even as fresh tears gathered in her eyes. Up close, she was even more beautiful than he'd thought. Maybe 23 or 24, with eyes the color of summer sky and a spattering of freckles across her nose. "Excuse me, miss," Adam said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Years of living mostly in silence had made him forget how to gentle his tone. "I hope you don't think me forward, but I couldn't help noticing during the service. You're smiling, but you're crying. Why is that?" She turned those blue eyes on him, surprise flickering across her features. For a moment he thought she might tell him to mind his own business and he wouldn't have blamed her. Instead, she let out a small, shaky laugh. "You're very observant, Mr. Norwood. Adam Norwood. I have a cabin up in the mountains, come down for supplies maybe once a month." "Felicity Reynolds," she said, extending a gloved hand. He took it carefully, aware of how his calloused palm and thick fingers dwarfed her delicate hand. "To answer your question, I suppose I'm crying because I'm sad and smiling because the preacher says I should find joy even in sorrow. I'm not sure I'm doing either one right. You mind if I ask what's making you sad?" Adam released her hand, though part of him wanted to hold on. Felicity glanced around at the dispersing crowd, then back at him. Something in his direct gaze seemed to decide her. "My father died 3 months ago. Heart gave out while he was working our land. It's just me now, trying to keep the homestead going. And this morning I realized it's been exactly 3 months to the day. The preacher was talking about joy in suffering, and I thought, well, Papa would want me to find that joy, so I tried to smile. But the tears wouldn't stop coming." Adam felt something tighten in his chest. He knew about loss. His own parents had died years ago, killed by fever when he was just 17. That was what had driven him into the mountains in the first place, unable to bear the emptiness of the farm they'd worked so hard to build. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and meant it. "No shame in crying, though, even if you're smiling while you do it. Thank you." She studied him with those clear eyes. "You don't seem like the usual church-going type, if you don't mind me saying." "I'm not," he admitted. "Something just pulled me here today. Maybe it was meant to be. Perhaps." A genuine smile, small but real, touched her lips. "Well, thank you for your kindness, Mr. Norwood. It's nice to know someone noticed. You heading back to your homestead now?" "I am. It's about 2 miles east of town." "Why?" "Because," Adam said, making a decision that would change everything, "you shouldn't be crying alone. If you don't mind the company, I'd like to ride out with you. Make sure you get home safe, at least." Felicity's eyes widened slightly. In another woman, he might have seen fear or suspicion. Instead, he saw something like relief mixed with curiosity. "That's very kind, but I've been managing on my own for 3 months now. I'm quite capable. Didn't say you weren't, but capable doesn't mean you have to do everything alone." He paused, searching for the right words. "I know I'm a stranger and you got no reason to trust me. But I give you my word, I mean no harm. Just seems to me that if someone's hurting, they ought to have company, if they want it." She was quiet for a long moment, weighing him with her gaze. Finally, she nodded. "All right, Mr. Norwood, I'd appreciate the company. My wagon is behind the church." They walked together in silence, and Adam fetched his horse, a sturdy roan gelding named Red, from the general store. He tied Red to the back of her simple wooden wagon and climbed up onto the bench beside her. The wagon was old but well maintained, and he noticed how competently she handled the reins as they set off down the dusty road leading out of Fort Laramie. The Wyoming Territory stretched out around them, vast and golden under the October sun. The year was 1875, and Fort Laramie had grown from a simple trading post into a proper town, though it still retained that rough frontier edge. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. "How long have you been up in the mountains?" Felicity asked after they'd traveled about a mile. "Going on 12 years now. Went up when I was 18 after my folks died. Thought I'd stay maybe a season, but I found I preferred the quiet, the simplicity of it. Wake up, hunt or trap, maintain the cabin, sleep, do it again. No complications." "Don't you get lonely?" Adam considered that. "Sometimes. But people always seemed more complicated than I could handle. Say one thing, mean another. Or they want something from you that you can't give. In the mountains, things are straightforward. A bear is a bear. Winter is winter. Everything is what it is." "That must be peaceful," Felicity said, and he heard the longing in her voice. "What about you? You said it's just you now. No other family." "My mother died when I was 12. Fever. After that, it was just Papa and me. He taught me everything about running the homestead. How to plant and harvest, how to care for the animals, how to fix things when they broke. He said a woman needed to be strong and capable out here, that I couldn't count on always having someone to do things for me." Her voice caught slightly. "I just wish he'd taught me how to do it all without him, how to not feel so terribly alone." They reached a modest homestead with a small house, a barn, and fields that had been recently harvested. Adam could see signs of hard work everywhere. The place was neat and organized, though clearly maintained by one person doing the work of two. "This is beautiful," Adam said honestly as he helped her down from the wagon. His hand spanned her waist easily, and he was careful to set her down gently before stepping back. "Your father built something good here." "He did." Felicity looked around with obvious pride and pain. 40 acres. We had a good corn crop this year, and I've got 6 chickens, 2 milk cows and an old mule. It's enough for one person to live on if that person works from sunrise to sunset. That's a lot of work for someone alone. I manage. There was no defensiveness in her tone, just simple fact. Would you like some coffee? It's the least I can offer after you rode all this way with me. Adam knew he should probably decline, head back to town for his supplies and then up to his cabin before dark. But looking at her standing in front of that empty house, smile still fixed bravely in place, he found he couldn't leave her just yet. "Coffee sounds good," he said. Inside, the house was simple but comfortable. Handmade furniture, curtains his mother would have appreciated for their neat stitching, a fireplace with a cooking pot hanging over cold ashes. Felicity moved through the space with practiced efficiency, building up the fire and setting coffee to boil. Adam sat at the wooden table, feeling oversized in the domestic space. "You really haven't had anyone to help you these past months?" he asked. "The neighbors, the Johnsons, they check on me sometimes. Bring food occasionally, but they have their own land to work, their own children to care for." Felicity got out 2 tin cups. "Everyone's kind, but everyone's also busy. That's how it is out here. What will you do when winter comes? It gets hard here, but nothing like what you'll face trying to maintain all this alone in deep snow." "I'll manage," she repeated, but he heard the uncertainty beneath the words. "I have to. Or," Adam said carefully, "you could accept help when it's offered." She turned to look at him, the coffee pot momentarily forgotten. "What are you offering, Mr. Norwood?" "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure yet," he admitted. "But I know what I saw in church today. I know what I see now. You're strong and capable, but you're also alone and hurting. And I'm thinking maybe I am too, even though I've spent 12 years pretending otherwise. So maybe we could help each other. Even if it's just me checking in on you regular-like, making sure you've got enough firewood stacked, helping with the heavier work." "Why would you do that?" "Because when you smiled through those tears, something in me recognized something in you." "I can't explain it better than that." Felicity poured the coffee with shaking hands, then sat down across from him. "I don't understand. You don't even know me. Maybe that's exactly why I can help. No expectations, no history. Just one person seeing another person who needs not to be alone with their grief." Adam wrapped his large hands around the warm cup. "My ma used to say that God puts people in each other's paths for a reason. I stopped believing that after she died. But today, sitting in that church, watching you cry while smiling, I thought maybe she was right after all." Tears welled up in Felicity's eyes again, but this time she didn't try to smile through them. She just let them fall, and Adam reached across the table to cover her hand with his. "It's all right to cry," he said gently. "You don't have to be brave every second." "Everyone keeps telling me to be strong," she whispered. "To trust in God's plan, to smile and carry on. But I'm so tired, Mr. Norwood, so very tired of pretending I'm not breaking apart inside." "Then don't pretend. Not with me." She looked down at his hand covering hers, this rough, weathered hand from a stranger who'd appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to speak. Then she turned her hand over, threading her fingers through his, and wept openly while he sat with her in the quiet house her father had built. They stayed like that until the tears subsided and the coffee grew cold in their cups. Outside, the autumn sun tracked across the sky, and somewhere in the mountains, Adam's cabin sat empty. But neither of them moved to break the moment. Finally, Felicity wiped her eyes with her free hand and gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "I must look a mess." "You look like someone who's been carrying too much alone for too long," Adam said. "But you don't have to anymore. If you'll let me, I'd like to help. I can't pay you. Didn't ask for payment." Then why? He considered how to answer that. The truth was complicated, wrapped up in 12 years of self-imposed isolation and a loneliness he'd only just begun to acknowledge. But maybe the simple truth was enough. Because when I saw you in church, I felt something I haven't felt in a long time. A connection. A purpose. And because I think maybe we both need this, even if we don't fully understand why yet. Felicity studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, Mr. Norwood, I accept your help, though I'll warn you there's a lot of work to be done before winter. Good thing I'm used to hard work then. He smiled and was surprised at how natural it felt. He couldn't remember the last time he'd smiled at another person. And call me Adam. Mr. Norwood sounds too formal for people who are going to be working together. Only if you call me Felicity. Deal. They drank fresh coffee and talked through the afternoon. Adam learned that Felicity's father, William Reynolds, had been a schoolteacher back in Pennsylvania before heading west with his wife and young daughter in search of land and opportunity. He'd filed his homestead claim in 1867, right after the territory opened up more to settlement. Felicity had been 16 then, old enough to work beside him in building their life from prairie grass and determination. He loved it here, Felicity said, staring out the window at the golden fields. He used to say this land had a soul, that you could feel it breathing if you were quiet enough. He'd stand out there at sunset and just watch the light change, smiling like he'd found heaven on earth. He wasn't wrong, Adam said. There's something about this land. It's harsh, but it's honest. I understand why he loved it. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, Adam insisted on checking her animals and making sure everything was secure for the night. He found the cows healthy, the chickens settled in their coop, and the old mule regarding him with wise, patient eyes from the small paddock. You've done well keeping everything going, he told Felicity as they stood together in the fading light. But I can see places where I can help. Your barn roof needs some patching before snow comes. You'll need at least 3 times as much firewood as you've got stacked, and that fence line on the east needs reinforcing. I know, she said quietly. I've been trying to do everything, but there's only so many hours in a day. Well, you've got help now. Adam looked toward the mountains, calculating distances and time. It'll take me most of tomorrow to get back to my cabin, gather some things, and come back. Day after, I'll start on that roof. You're really going to do this? I said I would. But you don't even know me, she repeated, as if still unable to believe his offer was genuine. Adam turned to face her fully. In the dying light, her hair seemed to glow like spun gold, and her eyes held depths of emotion that made his chest ache. He'd spent 12 years avoiding this exact thing, this feeling of connection and responsibility to another person. But standing here with her, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like coming home. Maybe I don't know you yet, he said, but I'd like to, and I meant what I said earlier. You shouldn't have to cry alone. Not anymore. Felicity reached out and touched his arm, her hand small against the solid muscle beneath his shirt sleeve. Thank you, Adam. I don't know what I did to deserve such kindness from a stranger, but I'm grateful. We're not strangers anymore, he said simply. He rode back to town as full darkness fell, his mind already planning everything he'd need to do. He'd have to pack supplies from his cabin, tools for the repairs, clothes suitable for staying in town rather than isolated in the mountains. The thought of leaving his sanctuary should have troubled him. Instead, he felt an anticipation he hadn't experienced in years. At the boarding house in Fort Laramie, Adam paid for a room and lay awake most of the night, thinking about blue eyes and golden hair and a woman who smiled through her tears because she didn't know any other way to survive her grief. The next morning, he made the long ride up to his cabin. The familiar path wound through pine forests and across rocky streams, climbing steadily into the higher elevations where he'd built his life. The cabin appeared as it always did. Solid logs chinked tight against wind and snow. A single room with a sleeping loft and a stone fireplace he'd built with his own hands. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it. Furs stretched on frames, dried meat hanging from the rafters, his rifle and traps organized neatly along one wall. This had been home for 12 years. Safety, solitude, everything he'd thought he needed. But as he packed his tools and extra clothes into leather saddlebags, Adam realized something had shifted. This cabin suddenly felt less like a home and more like a hiding place. And he was done hiding. He left early the next morning, Red loaded down with tools and supplies. The ride back to Fort Laramie took most of the day, and he arrived at Felicity's homestead as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. She came out of the house when she heard Red's hoofbeats, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face lit up when she saw him, and Adam felt his heart do something strange in his chest. "You came back," she said, and he heard the relief in her voice. "Said I would." He swung down from the saddle. "Where should I set up?" "Don't want to presume on your hospitality by staying in the house, but I'll need somewhere to sleep while I'm working here." "The barn has a loft," Felicity said. "It's where Papa used to store hay, but there's room for a bedroll. I'll bring you blankets." "That'll work fine." They fell into an easy rhythm over the following days. Adam would rise with the sun and work on whatever project needed attention most urgently. Felicity would bring him meals, and they'd eat together, talking about everything and nothing. He learned that she loved reading but had only a handful of books, which she'd read dozens of times. She learned that he could identify any animal track and predict weather with uncanny accuracy. The barn roof took 3 days to properly patch. Adam worked shirtless in the October sun, his muscular back and shoulders gleaming with sweat as he hauled materials and hammered shingles. Felicity tried not to stare, but she found herself inventing reasons to be near the barn, watching him work with an appreciation that went beyond gratitude for the repairs. "You're good at this," she said one afternoon. "Bringing him water, had to learn. Can't hire someone to fix things when you live alone in the mountains." He drank deeply, water trickling down his chin and onto his chest. "Your father built well, though. Good bones to this place. Just needs maintenance he wasn't able to finish." "He was planning to patch that roof in September," Felicity said quietly, "before his heart gave out. I'm sorry you lost him." "I'm sorry you lost your parents so young. At least I had Papa until I was 23. You were barely more than a child." Adam climbed down from the roof and sat beside her in the shade of the barn. "Age doesn't make grief easier. Loss is loss." "Is that why you went into the mountains? To get away from the grief?" "Partly. Also because I couldn't stand people looking at me with pity. Couldn't stand trying to run the farm my parents built, seeing their absence in every corner. The mountains were clean. No memories, no expectations, just survival." He turned to look at her. "But survival isn't the same as living. Took me 12 years to figure that out." "What changed? You did." "Seeing you in that church, crying while smiling, trying so hard to be brave when you were falling apart inside. It was like looking in a mirror, seeing what I'd been doing all these years. Pretending I was fine with being alone, when really I was just too scared to let anyone close enough to hurt me again." Felicity reached out and took his hand, a gesture that had become natural between them over the past days. "I'm glad you came to church that Sunday." "So am I." They sat in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the prairie grass. That evening, Felicity invited Adam to eat dinner inside the house rather than bringing food out to the barn. She'd made a stew with vegetables from her garden and salt pork from the smokehouse, and fresh bread that filled the house with warmth and comfort. "This is delicious," Adam said, realizing he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a proper meal at a real table with another person. "Thank you. Cooking for two is much nicer than cooking for one." She paused, setting down her spoon. "Adam, can I ask you something? Anything? Why did you never marry? In 12 years, surely there was someone." He was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer. "There were a couple of women in the early years. Came down to town, met someone at a dance or social. But I'd retreat back to the mountains and they'd want me to stay. I couldn't give them what they needed, and they couldn't understand why I preferred isolation. Eventually, I stopped trying. Told myself I was better off alone. And now I'm thinking I was wrong, or at least I'm willing to consider that maybe I was waiting for the right reason to try again." The look Felicity gave him made his pulse quicken. "And have you found that reason?" "I think I might have." The air between them felt charged with possibility. Adam stood and carried his bowl to the washing basin, needing movement to calm the racing of his heart. When he turned back, Felicity was standing close, having followed him across the small kitchen. "Adam," she said softly, "I need you to know something. These past few days, having you here, working together, talking with you, it's the first time since Papa died that I've felt like myself again. The first time I've smiled without forcing it, and I think it's because of you. Not just the help, though I'm grateful for that, but you, the person you are, Felicity." Her name was rough on his tongue. "I feel the same. Being here with you, it's awakened something I thought I'd killed years ago. Hope. The possibility of happiness, of connection." She reached up and touched his face, her palm soft against his bearded cheek. "Then why are we still pretending this is just about repairs and helping a neighbor?" "Because I don't want to rush you. You're grieving, and I won't take advantage of that." "You're not taking advantage. I'm telling you what I want." Her blue eyes met his steadily. "I want to stop being alone, and I think you do too." Adam covered her hand with his, turning his face to kiss her palm. "I do. But Felicity, if we do this, if we let this become what I think we both want it to be, I need you to understand something. I'm not good at halfway. If I let myself love you, it'll be completely, no holding back. That terrifies me." "Good," she whispered, "because I'm terrified too. But I'd rather be terrified together than safe and alone." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that felt like coming home. She fit perfectly against his chest, her head tucked under his chin. They stood like that for a long time, just holding each other, letting the truth of what was growing between them settle into their bones. "Stay in the house tonight," Felicity said finally. "Not in my room. I'm not ready for that yet. But there's another bedroom, the one that was going to be for a sibling I never had. Stay where it's warm, where we can talk more easily. Are you sure?" "I'm sure." So Adam brought his bedroll in from the barn and settled into the small bedroom with its simple bed and handmade quilt. That night, they sat by the fire talking until the logs burned low, sharing stories about their lives, their fears, their dreams. And when they finally went to their separate rooms, both of them slept better than they had in months, comforted by the presence of another person in the house. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Adam worked on the homestead during the day, making all the repairs that Felicity hadn't been able to manage alone. He split and stacked firewood until there were cords of it lined up against the house and barn. He reinforced the fence lines and built a new chicken coop that would better withstand winter snows. He checked the cows and made sure the mule had proper shelter. In the evenings, he and Felicity would cook together, eat together, sit by the fire together. They talked about everything. She told him about the books she loved, and he promised to bring more from town. He told her about the mountains, about tracking wolves and fishing clear streams and watching eagles soar between peaks. and slowly, carefully, they let themselves fall in love. Adam found himself thinking about her constantly. The way she pushed loose hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. The sound of her laugh when he told her stories about his early days learning to survive in the wilderness. The strength in her hands as she worked beside him. The vulnerability in her eyes when she talked about missing her father. Felicity found herself watching him work, admiring not just his obvious physical strength, but the care he took with everything he did. The way he'd speak softly to the animals. The patience he showed when teaching her a better way to sharpen an axe or stack firewood for proper drying. The gentleness in his hands despite their roughness and size. One November evening, after they'd been working together for nearly a month, they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the prairie. The air had turned cold, and Adam had draped a heavy blanket over both their shoulders, pulling Felicity close against his side for warmth. "Winter's coming fast," he observed. "Another week or two and we'll see real snow. The homestead is ready, thanks to you." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I couldn't have done all this alone. You would have managed somehow. You're stronger than you think. Maybe. But I'm glad I didn't have to find out." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Adam, what happens when winter really sets in? Will you go back to your cabin?" He'd been thinking about that exact question for days now. His cabin in the mountains was prepared for winter, stocked with supplies and secure against the elements. It was where he'd spent every winter for 12 years. But the thought of leaving Felicity alone in this house, going back to his solitary existence, filled him with a hollow ache he couldn't ignore. "What do you want to happen?" he asked. "I want you to stay," she said simply. "Not just through winter. Stay, make this your home, make this our home." Adam's heart pounded. "Felicity, are you asking me to marry you?" She pulled back to look at him, her blue eyes serious in the fading light. "I suppose I am. Is that too forward?" "I know we've only known each other a month, and maybe by town standards that's rushing things, but out here, life is different. We both know what it's like to be alone. We both know what we want, and I want you, Adam Norwood. I want to fall asleep knowing you're in the same house. I want to wake up and make coffee for two. I want to work this land together and build something lasting. So yes, I'm asking you to marry me." Adam cupped her face in his large hands, his thumbs gentle against her cheekbones. "Then my answer is yes. Absolutely yes." He kissed her then, soft and careful at first, then deeper as she responded. It was a kiss full of promise and hope, of loneliness finally ending and futures beginning. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Felicity was smiling that smile from church, except this time there were no tears, only joy. "When?" she asked. "Soon as you want. Tomorrow if the preacher's available," she laughed. "Let's give it a week. Time to tell the neighbors, do things properly, but no longer than that. I don't want to wait to start our life together." The next Sunday, they rode into Fort Laramie together and spoke with the preacher. The old man who delivered the sermon about joy in suffering looked delighted to hear their news. "I remember seeing you both at service that day," he said, beaming. Young lady crying while smiling, and this mountain man looking at her like she held all the answers to questions he'd been asking his whole life. "I thought to myself, now there's a pair that needs to find each other." "You could see that just from looking?" Felicity asked. "My dear, I've been reading people for 40 years. Some things are written plain as day for those who know how to look." They set the wedding for the following Saturday, giving time for word to spread and for Felicity to prepare. The Johnsons, their neighbors, were thrilled and insisted on helping with food for a small celebration after the ceremony. Other townspeople they'd met offered assistance and congratulations. Adam rode up to his cabin one last time to gather his remaining belongings, and close the place up properly. Standing in the small space where he'd lived for 12 years, he felt an odd mix of nostalgia and relief. This place had served its purpose, giving him sanctuary when he'd needed it. But it was time to move forward, time to build rather than merely survive. He packed his few valuable possessions, his father's rifle, his mother's Bible, a few books, his best traps and knives. Everything else could stay. Maybe he'd come back occasionally to check on the place, maybe not. Either way, it was no longer home. Home was down in the valley, in a small house on 40 acres, with a woman who'd taught him that strength and vulnerability could exist in the same heart. The wedding took place on a cold but sunny November Saturday. Felicity wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved for years, and Adam bought a new shirt and had his hair trimmed, though he refused to cut it short. The small church was filled with neighbors and townspeople, all eager to witness the union of the reclusive mountain man and the brave young widow. Except she wasn't a widow, Adam thought as they stood before the preacher. She'd never been married. But she'd lost someone just as important, and in some ways that made her grief even harder. There was no socially recognized role for a grown daughter mourning her father, no prescribed period of mourning after which people expected you to move on. Do you, Adam Norwood, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do. His voice was steady and sure. And do you, Felicity Reynolds, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do. Her smile was radiant, no tears this time, only happiness. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming and by God Almighty, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Adam, you may kiss your bride. Adam gathered Felicity into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, not caring that the entire church was watching. When they broke apart, she was laughing, and someone in the back started clapping, followed by everyone else. They walked out of the church into bright autumn sunshine, pelted with rice and good wishes. The celebration at the homestead afterward was simple but joyful. Mrs. Johnson had made a beautiful cake, and several neighbors brought food and drink. There was fiddle music and dancing in the barn, and Adam found himself swept up in the celebration despite his natural inclination toward quietness. "You're smiling," Felicity observed during a brief moment alone. "Really smiling. Hard not to. I just married the most beautiful, strongest woman in the territory, flatterer." But she kissed him soft and quick. "Though I'll admit I'm the lucky one. I got myself a husband who's strong enough to chop firewood all day and gentle enough to sit with a crying woman he didn't even know. Best decision I ever made, walking into that church." As evening fell and the last of the guests departed, Adam and Felicity stood together on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. It was officially their wedding night, and there was nervous anticipation in the air between them. "Adam," Felicity said quietly, "I should probably tell you that I'm a little scared." "Of me?" "No, never of you, just of disappointing you. I don't know much about being a wife in the physical sense." He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Felicity, look at me. We've got all the time in the world to figure things out together. There's no rush, no expectations. Whatever happens or doesn't happen tonight, it's enough that you're my wife and I'm your husband. Everything else we'll learn together." She relaxed visibly. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" "Pretty sure I'm the lucky one." They went inside together, and Adam banked the fire while Felicity disappeared into what was now their bedroom. When he followed a few minutes later, she was standing by the window in a simple white nightgown, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders, looking nervous but determined. "You're beautiful," Adam said honestly, his throat tight with emotion. "So are you." He crossed to her, and they came together naturally, all the careful touches and growing affection of the past weeks building into something deeper. Adam was gentle and patient, letting Felicity set the pace, and she responded to his tenderness with a passion that surprised them both. Whatever awkwardness existed at first dissolved quickly into genuine connection. And when they finally fell asleep, tangled together in the bed that had been hers alone for so long, both felt a peace neither had experienced in years. The winter that followed was hard but happy. Snow came early and heavy, blanketing the prairie in white and testing all the preparations Adam had made. But the homestead held firm. They had plenty of food stored, enough firewood to keep the house warm, and the animals were secure in the barn. Adam and Felicity fell into a rhythm of domestic life. They woke together, worked together, ate together, went to bed together. They talked by the fire on long winter evenings, learning each other's thoughts and dreams. They made love with increasing confidence and joy. They played cards and read books, and sometimes just sat in comfortable silence while snow fell outside. "Tell me about the mountains," Felicity would ask, and Adam would describe the high peaks where he'd spent so many years. "Tell me about your childhood," Adam would say, and Felicity would share memories of her father teaching her to read, her mother singing while doing chores, the journey west that had been both terrifying and exciting. They talked about the future too, the crops they'd plant in spring, possibly buying more livestock, maybe eventually children. "How many do you want?" Felicity asked one February night as they lay in bed listening to wind howl outside. "Hadn't thought much about it before," Adam admitted. "But now, maybe 3 or 4, a house full of life and noise." "That sounds perfect. What about you?" "I always wanted siblings growing up. So yes, several children sounds wonderful, though perhaps we should make sure we can handle one first." "Sounds reasonable." Spring came eventually, as it always did, melting the snow and revealing the land again. Adam spent March repairing winter damage and preparing fields for planting. Felicity worked beside him, and together they put in corn and wheat and vegetables. In April, Felicity realized she'd missed her monthly courses for the second month in a row. She told Adam one evening after supper, watching his face carefully for his reaction. He was quiet for a moment, letting the news sink in. Then a smile spread across his face, transforming his rugged features. "A baby, I think so. It's early yet, but yes, I think we're going to have a baby." Adam swept her up in his arms, spinning her around the kitchen until she laughed and demanded he put her down. "This is the best news, the absolute best news. You're happy then." Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He set her down carefully, then knelt and placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one. This is your papa. I can't wait to meet you." Felicity ran her fingers through his long hair, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "We're really doing this. Building a family. A life. We are." The pregnancy progressed normally, and Felicity remained healthy and active through the summer months. Adam became even more protective, insisting she not lift anything heavy and worrying constantly about her well-being. She found his concern endearing rather than smothering. In September, as the leaves began to turn and the air took on that crisp edge of approaching autumn, Felicity went into labor. Mrs. Johnson came to help, having delivered many babies over her years on the frontier. Adam paced outside the bedroom, driven half-mad by the sounds of Felicity's pain and his inability to do anything about it. Finally, as sunset painted the prairie gold and orange, A baby's cry split the air. Mrs. Johnson opened the door, smiling. "You can come in now, Papa. You have a son." Adam entered the bedroom to find Felicity propped up against pillows, exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a quilt. She looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Adam, meet your son." He crossed to the bed and carefully took the baby from her, cradling the impossibly small form against his broad chest. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was squalling indignantly at the indignity of being born. "He's perfect," Adam whispered, awed. "Absolutely perfect." "What should we name him?" Adam thought for a moment, then said, "William, after your father, if that's all right with you." Fresh tears spilled down Felicity's cheeks. "Papa would have loved that. William Adam Norwood." "Hello, William," Adam said to his son. "Welcome to the world." The baby quieted at his father's deep voice, and Adam carefully returned him to Felicity's arms. He climbed onto the bed beside them, wrapping his arm around his wife and child, and felt a completeness he'd never imagined possible. Mrs. Johnson left them alone, and the small family spent their first evening together in the quiet house, learning the sounds and rhythms of this new life they'd created. The years that followed were full and rich. William grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's strength and his mother's sunny disposition. When he was 2, Felicity became pregnant again, and this time delivered a daughter they named Charlotte, after Adam's mother. 2 years after that came another son, Thomas, completing their family. The homestead prospered under their joint care. Adam proved to have a talent for farming that he'd never discovered while trapped in grief on his parents' land. With Felicity beside him, the work felt purposeful rather than burdensome. They expanded their holdings, bought more livestock, and built a new, larger house to accommodate their growing family. The original house became a guest house, preserved carefully, and used when family or friends visited. Sometimes Adam would walk through it, remembering that first day he'd sat at the small table drinking coffee with a woman who'd smiled through her tears. It seemed like a lifetime ago now. Fort Laramie continued to grow and change around them. The railroad came through, bringing more settlers and more commerce. The territory moved toward statehood, but on their land, life maintained a steady rhythm. Plant in spring, tend in summer, harvest in fall, rest in winter. Watch children grow, teach them about the land, build something lasting. Adam never went back to his cabin in the mountains. Oh, he'd go hunting occasionally, taking William and later Thomas with him as they grew old enough, teaching them tracking and survival skills. But his home was here, in the valley, with Felicity and their children. On a Sunday morning in the autumn of 1885, 10 years after that fateful day, he'd walked into church for no reason he could name. Adam and Felicity dressed their children in their best clothes and drove the wagon into Fort Laramie for services. "Why do we have to go to church?" William complained. At 9, he'd rather be fishing. "Because it's good for the soul," Felicity said firmly. "And because church is where your father and I met." "Really?" Charlotte, now 7, perked up. "Tell the story again." Adam exchanged a smile with Felicity, then began the tale their children never tired of hearing. "Well, I'd been living alone in the mountains for years, convinced I didn't need anybody. But one Sunday something made me walk into church, and there I saw your mama 3 pews ahead. She was crying while smiling, and I couldn't figure out why. After the service, I asked her about it. And what did Mama say?" Thomas, not quite 5, already knew the story by heart but loved hearing it anyway. "She told me about losing her papa," Felicity continued. "And your father, who I'd never met before, offered to make sure I never cried alone again, and he kept that promise." "That's romantic," Charlotte sighed. "That's weird," William said, but he was smiling. They arrived at church, which had been rebuilt and expanded to accommodate Fort Laramie's growing population. As they filed into a pew, Adam caught sight of Felicity's profile against the morning light streaming through the window. For just a moment he saw her as she'd been that first day, young, grieving, brave, trying to smile through tears. She turned and caught him looking, raised an eyebrow in question. "Just thinking about how far we've come," he said quietly. "Any regrets?" "Not a single one." As the service began and the preacher spoke about love and faith and the mysterious ways God worked in people's lives, Adam held Felicity's hand and watched their 3 children fidget and whisper to each other. This was his life now, full of noise and responsibility and a love so deep it sometimes overwhelmed him. He'd spent 12 years hiding in the mountains, thinking solitude was safety, but solitude had just been fear wearing a different face. Real safety, real strength, came from letting people in. From sitting with someone while they cried. From building a life together through good seasons and hard. From choosing every day to show up for the people you loved. After church, they stood outside visiting with neighbors. The Johnsons, now considerably older, admired how much the children had grown. Other families shared news and gossip. It was all very ordinary, very domestic, very different from the isolated existence Adam had once thought he needed. "Papa," Charlotte tugged on his sleeve. "Can we have a picnic today? The weather's so nice." Adam looked at Felicity, who nodded. "That sounds perfect." They drove to a spot by the creek, spreading blankets under cottonwood trees that were just beginning to turn gold. Felicity unpacked the food she'd prepared while Adam helped the boys look for fish in the shallows and Charlotte gathered pretty stones. "Mama, look." Charlotte came running with her hands full of smooth river rocks. "Aren't they beautiful?" "They are. Maybe we can paint them later." "Will you teach me like Grandmama taught you?" "Of course." Adam watched his daughter and wife bent over the stones, talking about colors and designs. William and Thomas were now attempting to build a dam in the creek, their pants soaked to the knees. It was chaos and joy, and everything he'd never known he wanted. That evening, after the children were asleep in their beds and the house was quiet, Adam and Felicity sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The air had that particular autumn crispness that always reminded Adam of the day he'd met her. "What are you thinking about?" Felicity asked, leaning against his shoulder. "About how different my life would be if I hadn't walked into church that day. I'd probably still be in that cabin alone, convincing myself I was content. Instead, you're here, surrounded by chaos and children who track mud everywhere. Exactly where I want to be." She tilted her face up to him. "I love you, Adam Norwood. I loved you that first day when you asked why I was crying and actually listened to the answer. I loved you when you offered to help without expecting anything in return. I loved you when you stayed and made this place home. And I love you now more than ever. I love you too." He kissed her gently. "You saved me, you know, from a life half lived. From grief I'd buried so deep I couldn't even acknowledge it. You showed me it was okay to let someone in, to trust again, to live instead of just survive." "We saved each other," Felicity corrected. "I was drowning in loneliness and responsibility, smiling because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. You saw through that. You gave me permission to stop pretending, to be vulnerable, to accept help, to accept love." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that came from years of knowing each other deeply. Inside the house, one of the children called out in sleep, and Felicity started to rise, but the cry settled again. "Remember when it was just the two of us?" Adam mused. "That first winter snowed in together, learning each other. I do. It was wonderful, but this is better. A house full of life, our children healthy and happy, the land prospering. This is what I dreamed of while sitting in church crying, even though I didn't know it yet. What were you really thinking that day? When I asked why you were smiling through tears, Felicity was quiet for a moment, remembering. I was thinking that I was completely alone in the world, that my father had been my whole family and now he was gone. I was trying to smile because that's what the preacher said to do, find joy in suffering. But the truth was, I couldn't find any joy at all, just vast, empty loneliness. And then this mountain man with kind eyes asked me why I was crying, and for the first time in months, I felt like maybe I wouldn't have to carry everything alone. You never have to be alone again, not as long as I'm breathing. I know, and Adam, you don't either. If you ever need to talk, to cry, to rage at the unfairness of life, I'm here, always. I know. The years continued to pass, each one adding new layers to their story. William grew tall and strong like his father, eventually taking over much of the heavy farm work. Charlotte developed her mother's way with words and became the local teacher, following in her grandfather's footsteps. Thomas showed an aptitude for working with animals and became known throughout the territory for his skill with horses. Adam and Felicity grew older together, their dark and blonde hair mixing with gray, their faces gaining lines that spoke of laughter and hard work and life fully lived. They remained deeply in love, still holding hands during church services, still sitting on the porch together in the evenings, still learning new things about each other even after decades together. In 1895, 20 years after they'd met, Adam and Felicity became grandparents for the first time when William and his wife had a daughter. They named her Felicity, and Adam watched his wife hold the tiny namesake with tears streaming down her face. "Happy tears this time," she assured him. I know. More grandchildren followed over the years. The homestead that had once been worked by one grieving woman expanded to include multiple families, all living within sight of each other, all connected by blood and love and shared purpose. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1900, the family threw a celebration at the homestead. Children and grandchildren, neighbors and friends, all gathered to honor the couple who'd built something lasting from grief and loneliness. Speech. Someone called, and gradually everyone joined the chorus. Adam stood reluctantly, uncomfortable with being the center of attention even after all these years. Felicity rose beside him, her hand in his. "I'm not good with speeches," Adam began. "Most of you know I spent 12 years barely talking to anyone. But I'll say this. 25 years ago, I walked into church for no reason I could understand at the time, and I saw this woman crying while smiling, and something told me I needed to know why. That simple question changed everything. It led to this." He gestured at the gathered crowd, at the land, at the life they'd built. "So I guess what I'm saying is, pay attention to those impulses. Ask the questions. Sit with people in their grief. You never know what kind of life you might build from one moment of connection." Felicity squeezed his hand, then added her own words. "My father used to say that this land had a soul, that it breathed. I understand now what he meant. It's not just the land, it's the people on it, the connections we build, the families we create, the love we share." Adam gave me that understanding. He taught me that strength isn't pretending you're fine when you're breaking. It's asking for help, accepting it, building something together that neither of you could build alone. I love you all, and I'm grateful for every single day of this beautiful, messy, wonderful life. The celebration continued late into the night, but eventually people drifted home or to the various guest accommodations scattered around the property. Adam and Felicity walked to the original small house, which they still sometimes used when they wanted quiet. Inside, everything was mostly as it had been that first day he'd sat at the table drinking coffee. They'd kept it preserved, a reminder of where they'd started. "Come here," Adam said, pulling Felicity close. At 55, she was still beautiful to him, perhaps even more so because her face showed the journey they'd traveled together. "Dance with me." "There's no music. Don't need music." So they swayed together in the quiet house, holding each other as they'd done countless times over 25 years. Outside, Wyoming stretched vast and eternal under the stars. Inside, two people who'd found each other in grief had created something that would outlast them both. A family, a legacy, a love that had started with a simple question and grown into everything. The next morning, as was their habit, Adam and Felicity rose early and walked out to watch the sunrise. They stood at the spot where Adam had first told her she didn't have to cry alone, where he'd promised to help without expecting anything in return. "You ever think about that day?" Felicity asked. "Every day," Adam admitted. "Sometimes I wonder who I'd be if I hadn't gone to church. If I'd just gotten my supplies and gone back to the mountains." "Lonely," Felicity said simply. "We'd both be lonely." "Yes." They stood watching the light change, painting the prairie in shades of gold and pink. After a while, Felicity said, "Adam, there's something I want to do today." "What's that?" "Go to church. Just the two of us. Sit in those same pews where we met. Remember what it felt like before all this. Before 3 children and 5 grandchildren and all this land. Before we knew each other. When we were just 2 lonely people who needed to not be alone." So they dressed in their good clothes and drove the wagon into Fort Laramie. The church had been rebuilt again over the years, larger and grander than the simple building where they'd met. But the pews were arranged the same way, and Felicity sat exactly where she'd sat 25 years before. Adam sat behind her, as he had that first day, and watched the morning light catch in her hair, now more silver than gold but still beautiful. The preacher was younger now, the old man who'd married them having passed on years before. But the message was similar: faith, hope, love enduring through hardship. And then, in an echo of that long-ago morning, Felicity began to cry. But this time she wasn't trying to smile through the tears. She just let them fall, her shoulders shaking with emotion. Adam moved forward immediately, sliding into the pew beside her. He took her hand, just as he had that first day in her kitchen, and held on. "What's wrong?" he whispered. "Nothing's wrong," she said, wiping her eyes. "These are happy tears, grateful tears. I'm crying because I'm overwhelmed by how blessed we've been. How that terrified, lonely woman sitting here 25 years ago had no idea what was coming. That a stranger would care enough to ask why she was crying. That he'd stay. That they'd build this extraordinary life together. If I could go back and tell her, she wouldn't believe it." Adam pulled her close, kissing her temple. "I'd tell that lonely mountain man the same thing, that walking into church that day would lead to everything he'd secretly wanted but thought he didn't deserve." They sat together through the rest of the service, hands clasped, hearts full. And when they walked out afterward, they did it together, as they'd done everything for 25 years. The years continued their steady march. Adam and Felicity grew older, slowing down but never stopping. They passed more of the farm work to their children but remained active and engaged. They became great-grandparents and then great-great-grandparents, the family tree they'd planted continuing to branch and grow. In 1910, at the age of 65, Adam fell ill with pneumonia. For 2 weeks he burned with fever while Felicity sat at his bedside, refusing to leave. Their children begged her to rest, but she was adamant. "He promised I'd never cry alone," she said. "I'm promising him the same. I'm staying." Adam pulled through, though it took months to fully recover. When he was finally strong enough to walk outside again, he and Felicity stood in their usual spot watching the sunrise. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For staying with me. for not leaving me alone in the dark." "Always," she said simply. "You promised me that first day, remember? And I'm making the same promise to you. Whatever comes, we face it together." They had another good decade together, watching their family continue to grow and prosper. The homestead now encompassed several hundred acres worked by multiple generations. The small house where they'd met was designated a family landmark, preserved for future generations to see where it all began. In the spring of 1920, Felicity fell ill. It came on suddenly, a fever that wouldn't break. Adam stayed at her bedside just as she'd stayed at his, holding her hand, talking to her even when she couldn't respond. "Remember that first day," he'd say, "when I asked you why you were smiling through tears? Best question I ever asked, best answer I ever got." On a morning when the prairie was green with new growth, and the sky was that particular shade of blue that matched her eyes, Felicity opened her eyes and looked at Adam with perfect clarity. "Don't be alone," she whispered. "Promise me. Stay close to the children. Let them take care of you. Don't go back to the mountains and hide." "I promise," Adam said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "But Felicity, I don't want to be here without you." "You won't be without me. I'll be in every sunrise you watch, every crop that grows, every grandchild's laugh. I'll be there. I love you. I've loved you from that first day. I know. I love you too, so much. Thank you for seeing me that day, for asking, for staying, for everything." She closed her eyes then, her hand still in his, and slipped away peacefully. Adam held her for a long time, this woman who'd given him everything, who transformed his lonely existence into a life overflowing with love and purpose. The funeral was large, attended by family and friends from across the territory. They buried her on a hill overlooking the homestead, with a view of the prairie stretching to the mountains. Adam stood at the graveside surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and realized that while Felicity was gone, her legacy was everywhere. He kept his promise. Rather than retreat into grief and isolation, as he might have done in his younger years, Adam stayed close to his family. He moved into William's house, spending his days with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling stories about their grandmother, teaching them the skills he'd learned in the mountains. Every morning, he'd walk out to Felicity's grave and watch the sunrise, talking to her about the family, the land, his life. "We did good," he'd say. "That scared woman and lonely man in church, we built something beautiful." On a spring morning in 1923, 48 years after he'd walked into church and asked why a woman was smiling through tears, Adam Norwood passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78. They buried him beside Felicity, and their children erected a headstone that reads simply, "Together they built a life from one question and one answer, never alone." The homestead continued on through the generations. The small house where Adam and Felicity had fallen in love remained standing, preserved as a reminder of where it all began. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would visit it, touching the table where they'd first talked, standing in the doorway where they'd first kissed, feeling the presence of the love that had started everything. The story was told and retold at family gatherings. How a mountain man saw a woman crying while smiling in church, how he'd asked why, how he'd made sure she never cried alone. How from that simple act of compassion had grown a family, a legacy, a love that transcended time and death. On anniversaries of Adam and Felicity's wedding, the family would gather on the hill where they were buried, looking out over the land they'd worked together, at the house they'd filled with children, at the legacy they'd built from grief and loneliness, and the courage to ask a question and accept an answer. And sometimes, on quiet Sunday mornings when the light was just right, You could almost see them walking hand in hand across the prairie, heading toward the sunrise, together as they'd been in life, and as they would be forever in the hearts of everyone they'd touched. Two people who'd found each other in the darkest moments and built something that would last long after they were gone, proving that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply ask someone why they're crying and promise to make sure they never cry alone again.